Enforcer. It appears that our audio is down again. Everybody's saying no sound, can't hear voice.
Testing, testing. We're going to do a quick little test, see if we can hear it on the stream, and then we're going to start the news. Apparently, a whole load of stuff has gone wrong tonight, technically. So can you hear that, Matthew?
Yes, I can hear you now. People were saying they can hear me, but I think everybody's hearing you again as well now.
All right, so now that we've done that, hello everyone, I am the Enforcer, and today we're going to be covering the previous 24 hours of news in the war in Ukraine on day 39. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. There was a whole bunch of stuff that went wrong on OBS. For some reason, it didn't actually accept the new file I put in tonight with audio, which was really weird. And there was a whole bunch of other stuff that went wrong as well in the background, and then OBS decided to mute my microphone after I unmuted it. I don't know what's going on with OBS tonight, but it did do some weird stuff. So, once again, welcome to the stream. Sorry about that. And we're now going to start covering the schedule for tonight's stream and also the fundraiser that we've selected for tonight. We'll be covering the Northern Front in the Kyiv area. We will then transfer over from the Northern Front, well, what's left of it, for that matter, over towards the Eastern Front in the location unknowns, and then moving on down towards the Southern Front. There have been some major developments on the map today that we have been able to confirm. So the Eastern Fronts and Southern Fronts have kind of meshed into one, but we will still recognize our donors halfway in between what used to be the Eastern Front and the Southern Front. We will then continue on with the news here in the Southern Front as a whole, and then we'll cover the international news, the little bit we have, and then the stream will end for the night because as a fundraiser, well, actually, we will answer questions from the chat during the breaks because I just remembered, although we're not doing super chats, everyone's still going to be asking questions, and make sure to ask as many questions as you like. Usually on fundraiser nights, we have a hard time getting questions, and we would love to still answer everyone's questions if they have any. So make sure to ask. And so with that, we're now going to move on to tonight's sponsor, well, not sponsor, fundraiser, Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders is a fundraiser that we've done before on this channel. It is a wonderful charitable organization. As far as the spreadsheet goes, something like 80% of the money that is donated to Doctors Without Borders actually goes to providing the services and care that they say they provide, which is incredibly high. It's probably one of the best organizations on earth in terms of how much money they're actually using that's donated to them towards their cause. Another thing that's also great about them is that they are currently active and operating inside of Ukraine. And the reason why we didn't pick a new one tonight, we went with an old one, Doctors Without Borders, is because news has come out today of war crimes occurring all over the Northern Front as Ukrainian troops are now rolling through the areas that the Russians have withdrawn from or have been beaten out of. We're now seeing evidence of massive levels of war crimes all over, civilians being shot in the streets, being tied up, being, executed after being tied. Terrible stuff and unfortunate business. And so there are a lot of people who, of course, survived this in that area, and some of them are injured. I have one picture of someone who was injured in an incredibly sick way today, and I want to show y'all that so that way y'all can understand what's going on there as much as I've had to see today. And I'm trying to show y'all as much as I can without getting in trouble with YouTube. But make sure to donate to Doctors Without Borders because they're going to help out the people who were injured and did fortunately survive the Russian occupation. So with that being said, I thank y'all so much for coming here tonight. Sorry once again to everyone who had to experience the technical difficulties. Not really sure why any of that occurred. And with that, we're now going to move on to the news from the Northern Front, and we're going to start off on a high note, and I'm going to show y'all a destroyed T-72B3 somewhere in the Kyiv Oblast. We're not exactly sure, so the marker's not specific or accurate, but here is the destroyed T-72B3.
Русский мир, блядь. Ебучий. Це, блядь, моє рідне село, блядь. Асфальт тільки зробив. Зеленський тільки зробив асфальт.
As you can see, tank was completely destroyed, and it appears that it must have had some kind of ammo detonation while the tank was still intact, because we can see that the turret apparently lifted up and then fell over to the side of the tank on the side of the road. Wonderful stuff to see, and we're about to see what the Russians actually did in the middle of their occupations. At the beginning, it was pretty clear that they were leaving civilians alone for the most part. We would see columns drive by civilians. They didn't really seem to care about the civilians. But as time went on, information from behind the lines started to become less and less. And we start hearing from civilians less and less, of course. That's really the only way to explain it. And as time went on, I had the general assumption that while the Russians appear to have been targeting Ukrainian cities and killing civilians indiscriminately in Ukrainian-controlled areas, I had a general feeling that they were leaving the civilians alone that were now under Russian control, for the most part. We can see today that that wasn't the case at all, and this is very sensitive videos and information I'm about to show y'all here in a second. So if you are a little bit squeamish, make sure to not watch these videos because they are very graphic in their content. Anyways, we're now going to move on to the evidence of the damages we've seen in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area today, and it is incredibly disturbing. First, we can see the aftermath in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area in this video. I'm going to show you all the extent of damage. And we're going to jump through this video a little bit because it is 7 minutes long. But here you can see the ruins of the burned out buildings. We're now going to skip forward a little bit more. Let me shut that down real quick. We're now going to skip through. Hopefully the video will load quickly.
І поранений син. Так, є випадок, я так згадую.
I'm going to skip forward a little bit more. I'm going to skip through the parts of the interview because we don't really understand exactly what he's saying. So I'm just going to show you all the damage in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area. Now that's been liberated by the Russians.
Hostomel, було, в принципі, затишне селище, були місця відпочинку, було зелене селище. Було благополучне селище, були серйозні платники податків, бюджет.
As you can see, the damage just keeps on going. We're now going to skip forward a little bit more.
Новий, гарний,
blown out windows, burned out parts of buildings.
Просто стояв і цинічно танк розстрілював. Для чого? Таке враження, що він просто виколачував туди людей. Просто виколачував. Це дуже страшно. Тут багато аспектів, про які можна говорити. Окремо це їхній підхід, скажімо, мародерство. Мародерство росіян. Це теж це окремо теж можна розказувати. Оці всі, що складається ця ситуація, ця війна. Це жахливо. Це жахливо, і ми зараз узнаємо. Я думаю, що ми ще всі будемо узнавати.
We're now going to skip forward a little bit to the highway where there's a load of cars that were left.
Я дивлюся в Фейсбуці, її шукають уже.
And you see that civilians were trying their best to mark the cars with children inside. This is the Ukrainian/Russian word for children, deti, which means children in Ukrainian.
Двоє діточок, одної дитині 6,5, а синочку...
See a stroller that was abandoned and loads of refuse and garbage around. So I'm going to cut the video short because it's really just a revisiting of the stroller area. And now I'm going to show you all the more disturbing videos and evidence that have come out of the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area today. And it is incredibly unfortunate. That's really all I can say. I'm going to let y'all see this for yourselves and see what the Russians actually did to Ukrainian citizens while they were under Russian occupation. This, and once again I do have to tell everyone that this is incredibly graphic, but I feel like it's very important to show. This is part of a mass grave where 280 civilians were buried. We're supposing, of course, that these people were killed by the Russian military in some kind of mass execution, or they were killed in the bombardments that the Russians committed on the area when they were pushing through, and then they rounded up all the bodies and buried them in this pit. If this isn't an example of a war crime, I don't know what is. We're now going to move on to the next bit of news from the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area, where you can see more evidence of executions that occurred in Irpin. I'm showing this because the actual flesh of these people who were killed was blurred out, and so it's not entirely graphic, but the imagery in itself is very graphic in a way. So once again, viewer discretion is advised. If you are a little bit squeamish and sensitive to this kind of stuff, I suggest that you hop off the video for about a minute and come back. So without further ado, I'm going to show you all the video.
В одному з будинків Бучі. В одному приміщенні окупанти влаштували собі казарму. В сусідньому ж розстрілювали мирних мешканців. Їхні тіла і досі тут.
Колено, свои колено. Это Смельников. Сначала колено прострелил, видишь, что с коленом.
Зв'язали руки.
So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to explain kind of what happened, just in case if anyone is not entirely sure. The Russians rounded up these civilians and tied their hands behind their backs. They then led them into the basement of this building and executed them all, much like an Einsatz group in execution in World War II on this wall. Now, if this doesn't infuriate you about what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians, I just don't know what will. This is absurd, and it's unbelievable that the Russians have been doing this kind of stuff. Not even I believed until today that they'd be capable of conducting almost a genocide behind the lines, yet we can see now that it's clear that they are worse than abhorrent, and the normal Russian soldier isn't innocent of their crimes as well, because this right here isn't an artillery strike that was commanded by a colonel or a major. This right here is crimes committed by the lower enlisted ranks, such as privates, corporals, and sergeants. This stuff had to be carried out by the normal, average Russian infantryman. And here you can see it right here, that no part of the Russian army is without fault and without blame for crimes that are being committed inside of Ukraine.
Руки поставили на коліна до стіни. Постріл в голову. І все. Людини більше немає.
So that's the end of that video. We're now going to move on to the next bit of evidence of war crimes we've gotten in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area, where a Russian mother showed the exact spot where her daughter's body still laid, and the Russians butchered her in the mother's front yard of their house. I'm going to show you all this video. It's very graphic once again, and I suggest if you are a little bit squeamish that you do get off the video for a bit and come back in a few minutes.
Все одно ж треба забирати.
Треба забирати, так.
Ні, ну зараз ви...
Ні, все, залишайте.
Це приїде там
Зараз
служба.
І вона вийшла, думала, що наче, так?
Ну, да.
I hope the Russians pay for what they've done in Ukraine. It's not any longer just a war against the Ukrainians trying to annex the country or secure some kind of strategic goal. It appears now that they're trying to commit some kind of genocide against the normal Ukrainian citizens that were inside of the country. This removes the possibility in my mind that the Russians are just merely looking for some kind of strategic goal. It looks like they're viewing the Ukrainians as an inferior people and are trying to exterminate them in a methodical manner, much like the Germans tried to exterminate Slavic people in the 40s. It's completely abhorrent, entirely distasteful, and something should happen to these Russians, and they should pay for the crimes that they've committed. We're now going to move on to the last bit of video we've gotten now of the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area, where the Kyiv mayor toured the wreckage and damage that was found in this kind of metropolitan area.
Vitali, was siehst du da an dem Panzer?
Wahrscheinlich noch von innen explodiert.
Was macht das mit dir, hier so ein Schlachtfeld zu sehen?
Ich kenne diese Stadt, eine kleine Stadt, eine gemütliche, eine gute Stadt, und jetzt erkenne ich nicht, das ist eine Horror, das ist ein Gefühl, das ist eine Kino, ein Horror-Movie, so etwas zu sehen. Grausam, grausam. Wir müssen noch viele machen. Das ist, die Bürgermeister von dieser Stadt war sehr glücklich zu präsentieren, wie gut er hat gemütlich Stadt gemacht und jetzt
Bevor die russische Armee kam.
bevor russische
While we don't understand exactly what he's saying in the interview, what's very important to note in the background is the amount of Russian vehicles that have been destroyed on this one street alone. It doesn't end. It goes all the way into the horizon, and these vehicles are just endless. I mean, like the amount of destruction that the Ukrainians have wrought on the Russian armored forces is untold. I mean, like we already know the numbers specifically, but it's in the thousands. Well, at least 1,000 for almost each kind of vehicle. And for tanks, though, it's really around 750. But I'm sure y'all get the point of what I'm trying to say.
Und wir sehen dieses Ergebnis von diesem Krieg, wo sehr viele Leute sind gestorben. Unschuldige Menschen, Zivilisten.
Wenn man das sieht, die Menschen, die dort mit den Händen nach hinten getötet wurden, Zivilisten offenbar, wo es keine Zeugen gibt, wie du sagst, was muss das mit Deutschland machen aus deiner Sicht, auch mit der deutschen Politik?
Das ist klare Antwort. Nach solchen Bildern, ich verstehe nicht, wenn wird noch eine einzige bleibt, Putin verstehe.
Was ist mit Öl- und Gasembargo, was du immer wieder angesprochen hast?
Die Sanktion wirkt und wir verstehen, dass jede Wirtschaft abhängt von geschäftlichen Verhältnissen, aber Russland muss zahlen und hart zahlen.
So that's the end of the video and the end of the interview. But you can see that while the Russians did commit vicious crimes, some of those Russians paid for them on the spot, and hopefully the Ukrainians can gather up the ones that they find out are the war criminals and make them pay for their crimes as well and bring them to justice. So we're now going to move on to some news in the northern area of the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area, more so towards the Irpin floodplain, where we've seen old footage of an entire Russian column being destroyed on film. This didn't happen today. This happened a while ago while the Russians were still in the area. But here's the clip because it's incredibly interesting to watch. As you can see, the Russian vehicles are lined up in a line through the trees. This video is 4 minutes long, so do forgive me if I do skip forward a little bit to get to the points where something happens. As you can see, they're surveying the column. You can see that there is crew inside of these armored personnel carriers. We can see what appears to be the driver and the commander moving around inside of one of these BMPs. Now the column is on the move, and it is moving onto the road. Now we can see them moving out in the distance. And I believe this is the moment when the vehicles start getting smacked by the air-to-ground fire. Yep. Wait a minute. Pardon me. One of the tanks fired, apparently. The column is now stopped. Now we can see another tank firing. Or that may actually be the rounds hitting the tanks. It just looks more like they're firing. The tanks are, to be honest. And we're not seeing any smoke come from them, so I'm assuming that those tanks were just firing at that one moment. We're now going to skip forward a little bit more. Where you can see the tanks moving through the town. This appears to be a BTR-60, a BMP-2, and a T-72B3 in this one picture. We can now see the tanks continuing to move through the village. And it appears that they're now trying to hide the tanks across the entirety of the village. And it also appears that they may have some kind of truck that they've commandeered because it had a V on top of it. Now we can see what looked like the first vehicle to be hit out of all of them. Now we can see the second vehicle being hit. Now we can see the column kind of moving around in something of disarray and panic as they're now going to try and pass the first destroyed vehicle and try and get out of there. Now we can see another bomb has fallen on the Russians and has wiped out more armored vehicles, maybe even a tank. I'm not exactly sure about that at the moment. Now we can see the rest of the column rushing forward into this choke point that's now been made on the road, probably to their soon-to-be destruction. The rest of the column appears to have gotten past the roadblock in a way that's now been created, but it looks like they're not out of the woods yet, as strikes still continue on the vehicles, and these vehicles are going up in flames one after the other. It now appears that one of the tanks is still trying to move past the wreckage of the other vehicles that have been destroyed. Now we can see another vehicle has been hit. The Ukrainians are not letting up on these Russians. And now that we've seen the war crimes that these exact soldiers may have committed, it's nothing more than justice that's due to them at this point. We can now see another vehicle that was hit, apparently in the tree line. It must have tried to move off the road, but that apparently did not save it from the Ukrainian fire. We can now see another Russian vehicle being hit and destroyed, and now we're just watching, I believe, footage that we actually did see some time ago of the Russian vehicles being destroyed. So I believe that this is about 5 days old, honestly. But anyways, I'm going to stop the video there because the rest of it's just surveying the damage. Good stuff to see. And so now we're going to move on to a little bit more unfortunate news. I'd hate to throw on all the unfortunate news at one time tonight, but unfortunately, this is the day that this is the day after victory, where the Ukrainians are actually starting to assess the damages that have been caused by the Russians in these areas. And so there's nothing more than bad news, once again, in the village of Borodyanka, where we can see that the Russians killed the dogs as well. Apparently they went down into this metro station, from what it appears, or wherever this is. I'm not exactly sure. It may be a basement where dogs were being kept in a shelter of sorts, and they went down there and started to kill the dogs as well. Once again, this is very graphic footage. And so if you are a little bit sensitive to graphic imagery, please make sure to click off the video and then come back a little bit later. And so here's the video.
Зараз легкий димок. Ой, хороша.
You know, I mean, it's terrible to see people die, but I always have a very soft spot in my heart for dogs. I love dogs till the end of time, and so seeing that angers me more than seeing civilians get killed for some reason. I'm sorry if that doesn't make sense to anyone, but I hope that every single Russian soldier pays for even stepping foot into this country at this point. It's sickening what they've done, and they ought to pay for it. That's all I've got to say about that. We're now going to move on to the eastern area of Kyiv, where we can see the Russians once again move through a village while they were retreating and kill even more dogs. And then my question is, what did the dogs do to anyone? The dogs didn't do anything, and yet the Russians are going through and they're killing the dogs as well. The Russian army, there's no way you can even say anymore that there's some poor boys in the Russian army, because they're going through with almost a level of bloodlust, killing civilians, raping women, killing the daughters of mothers right in front of them in their own front yard. And the list goes on of the atrocities that the average Russian soldier is committing. I don't see any of these soldiers as innocents anymore. I see them all on the level of a German soldier in World War II, a criminal. And so we're going to move on to the last video we have of terrible news today. And I once again want to remind everyone that while we are watching videos right now of dogs that have suffered a terrible fate at the hand of the Russians, there are civilians out there who also died as well, and we saw that just a minute ago. And there are people who are traumatized and who are injured, and we will get to a location unknown showing a sick injury that the Russians inflicted on a poor civilian who was innocent and just minding his own business. And so if you find this stuff to be angering and you want to help out in the best way possible, I do highly suggest that y'all donate to Doctors Without Borders, because they are over there right now and they are trying to help out the best they can. And so once again, here in a second, once we cover all the news in the Northern Front, I will donate on stream my $100. I have almost no money in my savings account now, so that's almost the last bit of it. But I'm still going to donate because I'm going to do everything in my power to help out the Ukrainians, and I hope that y'all all side with me and help me help them out as well. And so I'm going to show y'all this video. Once again, it's incredibly disturbing and graphic. And so if you find this to be disturbing, or you can't stand graphic footage, make sure to leave for a bit and then come back a little bit later. And so here's the footage.
Масштаби скотства. Ординські. Тварюки. Тварюки. Собака у вольєрі. За що? У вольєрі мирна собака до всіх ішла. В руки. Собака вам згоріла чи що то, блядь. Да. Це мій сорентик ось, блядь, пацани. Так, і що?
The Russians are something. We're now going to move on to the Northern Front near Chernihiv, where we've seen that the Russians have not only been attacking and killing anything living, they also don't let the dead rest as well, as they went into a graveyard and started to desecrate the graves of dead Ukrainian soldiers. You can see here that they were taking sledgehammers to all of these tombstones and striking them to the point that some of them were completely destroyed. If this doesn't tell you what the Russian army really is, then I don't know what will. They not only are they targeting living people, they'll even go into the graveyards where nothing's happening at all and start attacking the dead. And that tells you everything you need to know about this kind of army. It's gross, it's sickening, and I hope that Western governments really start stepping up and doing something after seeing what's come out today as far as news of the atrocities that the Russians have been committing and the crimes against humanity that have been conducted inside of Ukraine. So with that being said, we've actually covered all the news in the Northern Front, unfortunately today, and I'm sorry everyone had to bear with it, but there was nothing but terrible and unfortunate news today and horrible stuff. But today I've kind of let my graphic filter on what I allow on the stream and not allow on the stream to be loosened a little bit, so that way y'all can actually see the actual extent and the effect of Russian war crimes and atrocities here in the Northern Front, and I'm sure that that's being reflected across the entirety of all parts of occupied Ukraine. It's terrible to think that that's the case, and I hope that the Ukrainians can bring an end to this very soon and hopefully liberate the parts of the countries that are currently occupied. And so, with that being said, we're now going to move on to 3 to 5 questions from the chat, and we're also going to recognize some of our largest donors tonight and let them know that we're incredibly appreciative of their support. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
So good afternoon, chat. It's good to be with you all. Unfortunately, that was some pretty heavy imagery. I want to be excited for the donations tonight, but that's tough to watch some of that video. It really is. But anyways, moving on to the donations tonight, we have a $200 Canadian donation from Sasha Grabowski. Thank you very much for your donation. I just want to recognize a couple of the top donations to Doctors Without Borders tonight. We have a $100 donation from James Reyes. We also have another one from Michael Stackpole. We also have one from Ruben Coolidge, Joseph Moody, Zeta Lane, Terry Morganson, Thomas Simmer, Junebug72, among many others. And as much as I would like to read off every single donation that we get on the channel, unfortunately there are too many to do that. So with that being said, like the Enforcer loves to say, it's time to move on to 3 questions. So our first question up for the night is from John Wary, who says, how can the world make Russia pay for the war crimes shown in the videos?
One of the few ways that the West can make Russia pay for their crimes is to make sure that we continue the sanctions after the war and bring the Russian economy to their knees, and hopefully the government along with it. We've also gotten a little bit of news, we'll touch on that later, that it seems like a decent amount of Russians just blindly support the government and don't even care what they're doing to the Ukrainians, and in fact encourage the pretty much extermination of the Ukrainian people. But we'll get to that later, and I'll show that to y'all in a bit. But I believe that that's the only way that we can really get at the Russians right now is through severe economic sanctions, the likes of which the world has never seen. And so I thank you very much for the question. That's kind of my opinion on it. Sorry if it's short, but I'm still pretty angered about what I've seen on film today. Of course, I was angered when I saw these and selected them for tonight's news, but I wanted to show it to y'all so that way y'all can understand the extent of what's going on there. And so, thank you very much for the question, and we're going to move on to the next one.
And the next question we have up for the night is from James Reyes, who says, Enforcer, do you think there is any amount of sanctions that would cause Russia enough harm to stop hostility towards Ukraine?
Could you read that question to me again real quick? I was kind of a little distracted there.
Yeah, he says, Enforcer, do you think there's any amount of sanctions that would cause Russia enough harm to stop hostility towards Ukraine?
I believe that there is. I believe that if the Ukrainians were to continue to push the Russians out of the country, I think that would most likely lead the Russians to have to sign a peace agreement. At this point, I think I'm kind of on board with everyone else, at least in the principle of thought, although it may not be possible for the Ukrainians to try and reclaim Donetsk and Luhansk as well as the Crimea. But we'll just have to see if that's possible in the future. But as far as trying to cease Russian hostilities, the best thing to do is to keep on beating them and push them out of the country. And so I thank you very much for the question. It was a pretty good one. And so with that, we're going to move on to 2 more questions, and then we're going to move on to the Eastern Front and the location unknowns.
And real quickly, I just want to recognize a couple of large donations that just came in. We have one from Tony Gilgren, we have one from Aaron Packman, and one from Greg Asht. Thank you all for your donations, and there were some others that came in, but unfortunately, like I said, I can't list them all off, but we do see them, and we do appreciate it. As always, all of the donations are going to Doctors Without Borders, so that means this is going directly to helping the people of Ukraine. So the atrocities you're seeing in the videos, they're helping directly to help those victims out. So definitely a great charity, and we appreciate all of your support to that charity. So our next question up is from Level 70, who says, Enforcer, more oil refineries destroyed in Ukraine. How might this impact Ukraine's defense?
It doesn't appear that it's impacting their offensives at all anymore. It appears that while it is probably causing some damage to the Ukrainian logistical chain, while we've seen these attacks going on for weeks, it hasn't actually stopped them from curbing their offensive abilities whatsoever, because a large amount of the oil silos in the northern front around Kyiv, Vasilkiv, Zhytomyr, and so on were destroyed within the first 2 to 3 weeks of the war, and then as time went on, we still saw that the Ukrainians were able to push counteroffensives in that area without the need for the oil reserves that were inside of those silos. So I don't really think it's affecting their offensive capabilities a large deal, or at all for that matter, and I think that the Ukrainians will be able to pull through even with the loss of that oil and manage to supply their units somehow. I'm not entirely sure how they still are, but we do know that they are successful at it as of now, and that they're not, being stalled in any way, shape, or form at the moment. So I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that answers your question in a way. And so we're going to move on to one more question, and then we're going to start covering the location unknowns and the Eastern Front news as a whole.
Okay, and just so everybody knows real quickly, we are working to clear the Russian bots in the chat, but there are quite a bit tonight, so we're kind of a little overwhelmed and understaffed. So just know that we are working as quick as we can on that. Our next question up is from Alex Ambrose, who says, Enforcer, what is your take on why people in the U.S. are defending Russia and its war crimes? I expect it from the Russians, but when I see Americans do it, it's like a gut punch.
Well, I don't like to try and get opinionated on this channel, but I think people on both sides of the political spectrum are kind of in on trying to support the Russians in a way and act like what the Russians are doing is right. And to the people who say that, I believe they're pretty stupid, and they're not actually looking at the situation as what it is. The Russians invaded Ukraine illegally, as far as international law is concerned. They had no reason to. Their official causes that they stated didn't make any sense. I don't think that there's any basis for them to go into Ukraine and do what they did, yet they are doing it right now. And so, to start off, the invasion is illegal. Secondly, we have seen that in the middle of the front, they've been attacking civilians directly through artillery strikes, and other means, you know, that are pretty much caused by the combatants in the middle of a front line that are leading to the death of civilians. That's a war crime. The third thing that we've now seen today is that not only has the killing of civilians happened on the front lines, it's happened in Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine, where it appears that the Russians are gathering up civilians and killing them en masse. Now, all these things put together, I don't understand why anyone in America would sit there and say the Russians are doing the right thing. And a lot of people, of course, are going to say, oh, well, we did that in Iraq. No, we didn't. I mean, like, while we may have killed civilians in Iraq, yes, we did. There's no denying that. We didn't sit there and actively encourage executions and so on. And whenever those did happen, it was a massive deal. It made national news, and the people who were in charge of committing those war crimes were held accountable for what they did. And there's a huge difference in between what the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan and what the Russians are doing right here. Because while it happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, to kind of recap that a little bit, the U.S. always held those people accountable. The Russians encouraged their soldiers to do this, and it looks like it's actually sanctioned by the command of the Russian military. And so that's the difference. And I don't know why Americans would support this. I don't care what side they're on. You know, I've heard some from the left and the right. If you support the Russians and what they're doing, you're a pretty stupid person. That's not even really an opinion. That's a fact, considering the evidence that we've gotten. And someone who's supporting Russia is really a traitor to this country, considering that Russia is a direct rival to the United States internationally, and now certainly they are a direct rival to the United States and its national interests. And so supporting Russia is pretty much being a traitor to the country, in my opinion. But then again, that's my opinion. Everyone take that with a grain of salt. But at this moment, seeing what we've seen, I hope a lot of people can agree with me in that statement. So let me know in the chat if you agree or not. And we're now going to move on to the location unknowns and the news from the Eastern Front as a whole. So, the first bit of news we've gotten today is that there was a video from an American volunteer. I'm going to show you all this video real quick. It's not too long, but he is filming the sound of distant artillery in the distance.
Yep. Artillery shell. Nice. This guy needs a helmet.
So that's the end of the video. You could hear the American shout as the artillery rained down somewhere in the distance. We don't exactly know whose side was firing or where it was landing, but that's all we can get from that video. We're now going to move on to the next bit of video, where we can see the Russians release a propaganda film about the Ka-52s. Once again, this is entirely nothing more than fantasy fairy tale stuff, because we know that the Ka-52s and the helicopter force of the Russians are not facing easy time in Ukraine, as they're having to, of course, angle upwards and fire the rockets in just a general direction with a large spread, because they're scared of being shot down by ground fire. And we can still see, with them doing that, they are still being shot down by ground fire. We actually confirmed that the Mi-28 we showed on stream the other day was in fact shot down by a Star Streak system that the United Kingdom provided. So I got to thank the British for providing such a wonderful anti-air defense system to the Ukrainians, because it appeared that it did the job just right. Not too much, not too little, just down the middle. So anyways, I'm going to let y'all see the video of the Ka-52s in operation right here. As you can see, while the Russians are trying to make a propaganda film about this looks like it's probably several days old, because this kind of looks like the Irpin floodplain. the helicopters had to tilt upwards with a high angle of attack and fire the rockets into just that general direction. So the helicopters probably don't even really see what they're firing at all too well. They're just firing the rockets. The spread gets wider as they fly at further distance. And so they're just hitting this large indiscriminate area with rocket fire. That's pretty much the explanation of what's happening here.
Понял. Так, я держу. 865, я волна. 859, оставляйте ПСО. Принял 865.
And so that is the end of that video. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a Stugna wipe out Russian tanks. And the video loaded. So we're looking at the footage from Stugna. The tank is, of course, in the distance. They've got the crosshairs on it. It looks like the Stugna hit, and the tank then boiled over. Good stuff to see. It's good to know that the Ukrainians are still pushing the Russians back in some places and holding them in others. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a Russian plane get shot down. It appears, from what the information we were able to gather, we're not exactly sure where this occurred, but it was some kind of Su-27, Su-35 aircraft that was shot down. The pilot did manage to eject, and he was captured later on, and the aircraft, of course, plummeted into the ground and exploded. As you can see right there, there's the aircraft.
Ебать, прям на дом. Ебать. Вот.
So, good stuff to see. Once again, the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces are doing an incredible job of making sure that the airspace still remains contested. While we don't know the situation of the Ukrainian Air Force, some say that it's almost been entirely destroyed and they only have a few aircraft left. Others say that it's still hanging on a pretty good bit, but the general consensus that we can get is that the Ukrainian Air Force has taken a decent amount of losses, and so now the Ukrainians are relying entirely on ground anti-air to make sure that the airspace does stay contested and that the Russians don't have free reign. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a harrowing video from a Ukrainian soldier where he is trying to show the damage of the location they are in, and it appears that some kind of enemy fire came in and exploded near him. Hopefully he wasn't wounded, but it did sound like he was at least shocked and yelled out in some kind of shock as to how close the fire was. But nonetheless, here's the video.
Я воював нахуй. Що я не воював, або ще щось, сука. Ось нахуй я, їбать. Напередку, їбать. Вона в хату, їбать, залетіла. От там вдалі виїхав їхній танк і беха, блядь.
So once again, that was incredibly close. I hope that that soldier was all right. It sounded like he was he was screaming at the end, but we're not exactly sure why he was screaming. We don't know if he got injured, or we don't know if it was just incredibly close and it freaked him out. Hopefully it just got incredibly close and it freaked him out enough that he screamed and he didn't actually get wounded. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of video, where we can see Ukrainian soldiers rest in a field. I'm sure that they've been working incredibly hard to defend their country, and so they do get some well-deserved rest here and there. Unfortunately, I'll have to keep the video muted because there is copyrighted music in it. But it's good to see that they are going to make sure that they're well rested, even though it looks like an uncomfortable spot to sleep in. And they're going to continue the fight and bring it to the Russians. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where you see the Ukrainian farmers capture a Russian command vehicle. Once again, this is more of a high-value target than normal. Russian command vehicles can, of course, hold classified information. Of course, it usually is standard that the classified information held within these vehicles is destroyed before the crew abandons. So I don't know if that's been the case in this vehicle or not, but it is still good to see that they did manage to capture another command truck. So here's the video. So you can see them trying to pull it out of the Rasputitsa. So you can see they got it out of the Rasputitsa, which is something that the Russians apparently weren't able to manage, but it looks like the farmers, having been very experienced in their own fields, was able to pull the command truck out. So now we can see them pulling it on down the road. Or, wait a minute, hang on, that appears to be the truck. I guess, I don't know what they did. I guess they got like a wet towel and maybe they just rubbed the O off the front. But it appears they actually got the truck running once it got out of the Rasputitsa, and now they're driving it down the road, I'm assuming. So now we can see that they've captured what appears to maybe be a Russian Tiger armored car. And they're taking a look at some of the shells that they found along with the vehicle. So that's the end of that video. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we have seen the Russians brand a Ukrainian civilian with the symbol of, well, actually, I already just got the news in the middle of this video over email that the video has been age restricted, so hopefully this is under that age restriction qualification. But they branded a Ukrainian civilian with a swastika. So I'm just going to say that. Hopefully YouTube doesn't strike me with that more. But look at, this is sick. That's all I can say. Take a look at this. Look at it for yourselves. I don't know if this man is dead. I'm assuming he may be dead. And they branded him with a swastika before they killed him. And I'm sure they did that while he was alive. And so you can probably get a good idea of the amount of pain and torture they put this man through before they killed him. This, you know, I can't even put it into words how angry this makes me. And I hope that our Western governments come together and start coming down on the Russians so tough with sanctions and their actions against them that the Russians will hopefully collapse in the near future as a government and maybe even a nation. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see Ukrainian grandmother welcome the Ukrainian liberating forces into her village. It's a sweet little video. She was offering to make them food and stuff, and so I'm going to let y'all see it. It's very sweet.
Ой, пережили ці грохоти, це все на цьому.
Бачите, прийшли до людей, а вони нас зустрічають. Супчику зварили.
Ой, Боже, я така рада. Чекайте, бо баба, геть, баба.
Гарнюні, як все, як справжня україночка.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Героям слава! Мої герої, мої
Дивіться,
хороші.
є оце, дивіться, горить.
Є, вже вибери.
Все?
Вибери.
Та ладно, не треба.
Що це не надо?
Гарячого зараз супчика
Оце
з'їмо.
гарячого.
Да. Ну як ви тут, все хорошо?
Я ранена.
Ви ранені були?
Да. 8 березня, коли бандити зайшли в село, і мене зразу схватило, ось сквозне ранення.
Осколочне?
Осколочне, вийшло під лопатку. Я це місяць почти живу, не
А
в
я це вас так
лікарні.
обнімаю крепко і не знаю, що ви ранені.
Може, трохи зажило, мені просто провірте
Да.
всередині, що там порвало, може.
До свадьби
Бо
заживе.
вийшло насквозь.
Ну ви молодець.
Ну, як з першого дня. Полежала 2 дні, давай їсти варити.
Anyways, it was a very sweet little video. You could see that she was incredibly happy to see that the Ukrainian army had liberated her village. And she also showed the soldier where she had actually been injured by a Russian bomb. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we have seen Russians destroy a bus that was evacuating the wounded. This bus was apparently making rounds, trying to pick up wounded civilians. and bring them to a hospital. But then the Russian army fired on the bus, killed the driver, and destroyed the bus along with it. So here's the remnants of that bus. And it just lets you know how much the Russians really care about following the rules of war and just common sense and decency and regard in the battlefield. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Ukrainians destroy Russian vehicles. So here's the bit of film. We can see here that it looks like there's a supply truck and some other vehicle. I can't really tell what it is. It looks like it may be another supply truck. An ATGM is fired and starts traveling towards the direction of the vehicles. Still traveling at this moment. And it appears that this one's trying to do a three-point turn or something. We can now see the ATGM heading towards that truck. And bam, hit it dead on.
Второй в кабину, быстро, бегом, бегом, бегом. Ну, работай, работай.
Another ATGM is now fired. I'm assuming that they're going for the second vehicle on the right side of the screen. We'll probably see it enter frame soon. Yes, we can see it on the right side there. It's this little ball of light. It's now flying towards the second vehicle. Hit the second vehicle and took it out as well. Good stuff to see. The Ukrainians are still raining hell on the Russian supply lines and their logistical support. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see Ukrainian soldiers treating pets well as compared to what the Russians are doing to pets that they're able to find. Here we can see them loading up some kind of large black lab into the back of an Isuzu, which is kind of cute how the dog is looking. We can now see this sweet little dog. I don't know exactly what kind it is. Honestly, it kind of makes me think it's a corgi that's tricolor. So happy to see this being well taken care of. In the next bit of pictures, we can see a cat. It appears that it may have had a little bit of its ear taken off, but nonetheless, it looks a little disgruntled. I don't really know much about cats. I've never had a pet cat, honestly. So we're now going to move on to this dog, where they can see they're playing with it inside of an abandoned house. In the next picture, we can once again see another cat. In the picture after that, a kitten. That's a really cute kitten. Like that one. Then in the next one, we can see some kind of gray cat. Very sweet looking cat. And I'm just so glad that the Ukrainians are actually trying to take care of pets the best they can. We also know that there are nonprofits over there right now trying to help out pets as much as possible. I'm just not exactly sure which ones, and unfortunately I haven't been able to find an EIN number for any of them to be able to manage a fundraiser for them. So I still think that Doctors Without Borders, even though the loss of pets is unfortunate, saving human lives is of course precedent. And so I still think that Doctors Without Borders is an incredibly good charity to support. And so we're going to cover the last three bits of location unknown news. Then I'm going to take a quick break on stream to, it's going to be like a minute or so that way I can donate my $100 to the cause. We're now going to move on to the last three bits of news, where we see Belarusian volunteers helping out the Ukrainians and wiping out Russian units further down the street. Here's that video right here.
Горят москалі.
Да, горят чьи-то жопки.
Живе Білорусь?
Конечно.
Умирає Росія.
Good stuff to see. It's always good. It's great to know that there actually are some Belarusians that have crossed the border and joined the fight on Ukraine's side, instead of just sitting in Belarus and waiting around for their government to do something or maybe not get involved at all. We're now going to move on to the last two bits of location unknown news, where we can see an incredibly grateful citizen offering up their food to the soldiers, the little bit they have left. And so here's that video.
Все хорошо, идите отдыхайте. У нас там еда есть, мы вам привезем. Все есть? Хлеба пока нема.
And you know, this woman must be incredibly grateful, considering all the horrors that she's probably seen under Russian occupation. You know, she must be more than happy to see the Ukrainians come back through, knowing that she'll no longer have to live that kind of nightmare and see all the things that we saw happen to civilians in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area. And I'm very sure that kind of stuff is being repeated across the entirety of the country. So we're now going to move on to the last bit of location unknown news, where we can actually see pictures of that Su-27 after it hit the ground. It looks pretty decently flattened, and it's also entirely destroyed. Here we can see the chair, apparently, that the pilot ejected out of. And so, good stuff. It's good to know that the Ukrainian air defenses are still working tirelessly to make sure that the airspace is contested. And so with that, we've actually covered all of the location unknown news, and so I'm going to uphold my end of the bargain and make sure that I put in my $100 to support Doctors Without Borders again. So give me all just a second. Make sure not to leave because I'll be right back in a minute, and I'm going to donate to the cause. So give me just a second. I'll be right back. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. It did it again. Stand by, everyone. Let me go pull up my maps. If for some reason it shut down the map software again, but I did just donate. Hopefully y'all all saw that, and hopefully it inspires some of y'all to also support Ukraine as well. So let me get back to my map of day 39. There we have it. And so now that we've covered all the location unknown news, and now I have donated to Doctors Without Borders as well, I hope we can get to the $12,000 goal, maybe even well above and beyond it. Back during our first two fundraisers, we were actually able to raise $25,000 and $30,000 a pop, so hopefully we can do that again. So we're now going to move on from the location unknowns towards the Sumy area, and the news that we've gotten from Sumy is, of course, non-existent. This tells us that the Russians apparently are not meeting any success there, and the Ukrainians may be holding their ground or pushing them back. Usually the Ukrainians are incredibly reluctant to upload videos online because they know the power that an online video holds and the pinpointing of locations that can occur because of it. And so we haven't seen them put anything up about any sort of progress or any sort of fighting in the Sumy/Troishninets area at the moment, but we will have to wait, of course, and just diligently look out for videos that may be coming from the Sumy/Troishninets area and see if any progress has been made. We're now going to move on down towards the Kharkiv area, where I once again have to say, and also we're going to cover what's happened over here on this part of the front, I have to say that once again, no news has come out of Kharkiv. Once more, this does suggest that there has been a lack of combat, or it could be suggesting that the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back. They're not uploading anything onto the internet, so that way they're not giving away their current positions if the Russians don't already know them. And that's kind of like the situation that we can assume here in Kharkiv. Once again, that's entirely assumptions because we have no hardcore evidence to back up those claims. We're just going to have to wait and, of course, diligently look out like we are in the Sumy area for any news that will come out on the Kharkiv area and see if the assumptions can be backed up in fact or not. So with that, we're now going to move on to a major frontline development that has kind of made the Eastern Front and the Southern Front merge into one large front. What's happened here is that we got video evidence today in Rubizhny showing that Russian soldiers are actually fighting here. And on top of the video evidence that we've gotten that they're fighting in Izium, we have been generally able to assume, since no other video evidence has come out from the rest of this area, hear them circling with my mouse, that there actually is no Ukrainian forces in this area, and so the Russians must control it. We've kind of been on the fence about that for about a week and a half at this point, but now we have enough evidence to confirm that this area must be controlled by the Russians, and so the Russians control a sizable amount of the Donbass, almost the entire Luhansk region. So we're now going to move on to a couple of questions from the chat, about 3 to 5 of them, and we're also going to recognize some of our larger donors for tonight's fundraiser. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
Okay, so it's quite a busy night with the chat and the donations, so please bear with me here. We have a $500 donation from Jess P. Thank you so much. That is tremendous. I think that's the biggest donation of the night. Also, we have a $250 donation from Stephen Wheeler, a $220 donation from Danger Mouse, and then I want to recognize some $50 donations. We have one from Can Kitty, T. Lou, Oregon J, longtime channel supporter Zeta Lane. We also have one from Vern, as well as a $100 donation that just came in from Kenneth Casildo. Thank you all very much for your support. We just topped 10,000 on the donation, so we are extremely close to reaching our goal, and we just have a short ways to go. So absolutely tremendous work, you guys, and I'm sure the enforcement wants to make a comment, so I'll be quiet for a minute so you can talk.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And I would like to say to everyone that we have reached $10,000 over the course of 1 hour. That is huge. That lets me know that there is huge support for Ukraine still. And one thing that I've kind of been getting concerned about is that this may be starting to fall out of the public sphere, kind of like the public eye here in the U.S. People do have a short attention span. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just normal human nature. And so people, after things occur for a while, just stop paying attention to it. So I'm so glad to see that so many people still care about Ukraine enough to actually support causes that are over there at the moment. And so I thank you all so much for the huge donations, the little ones, and everything in between, and helping me continue to do what I originally set out to do on this channel, which is support Ukraine and report the news. I am sorry to people who come here for non-biased reporting that sometimes my opinions do seep into the news here and there, like talking about what's going on with the war crimes that we're seeing in the Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin area and beyond. But I do have to remind everyone of this. While I do try and keep non-biased reporting, I am pro-Ukrainian, and that kind of stuff is a non-biased statement to say that it's a war crime and people should be held accountable for that. That is the rules of war. People who commit war crimes should be held accountable for their crimes. So I'm sorry if that offends you, but if that offends you, while I try and keep it non-biased and I don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers as far as anything is concerned in that regard, you're probably in the wrong place watching the wrong kind of news if that kind of factual statement that's somewhat based in opinion offends you. So I'm just going to put that out there. But I thank everyone else once again for your support. It means a lot to me, and we're getting a lot of help out to Ukraine at the moment. So make sure everyone keep up the great work. I thank you all so much once again. And so with that, we're going to move on to about 3 to 5 questions from the chat, and then we're going to move on to the news from the Southern Front. And so what do we got, Matthew?
And real quick, I want to recognize a $50 Canadian donation from Studio 2000 Productions. Thank you for your support. As well, I've noticed a couple people mentioning that they're not sure how the donation system works on here. So real quickly, YouTube takes care of the donation fees or any fees that might have to do with the donation itself, and it goes directly to the charity. So if anybody's concerned with that, that's how it works. So no worries about that. It's all taken care of by YouTube. So moving on here, our next question is from Daryl Fawcett, who says, Enforcer, how do you figure out where the Russian fronts are and where the Russians have advanced or retreated? Do you confirm by news reports or figure it out on your own? Thanks.
I mostly figure it out on my own, usually by video evidence. Like, for example, if we see Russian forces fighting in the town of Rubizhny, we know good and well that the front line is probably inside the town. So that's how I've kind of been making out the front lines for a good while now, is just straight off of raw video evidence. And then sometimes reports, like the reports from the Ukrainian government that the entire northern front had collapsed for the Russians and they had withdrawn, that I did get as a report. But most of the time, the front lines are adjusted based off of video evidence. So I hope that answers the question. And with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And the next one is from Zeta Lane, who says, Enforcer, it appears that Russia sent in their best equipment and troops from the very start, but with all the damage, how can they mount any kind of a serious offensive in the east?
I don't think they will actually be able to manage any kind of serious offensive. We know from the start that their logistical situation has been incredibly poor, if not terrible, and so that's not going to change. They're going to put more units like they did in the northern front into the eastern front. Example, the 40-mile long convoy, and in the process of doing that, they completely destroyed the logistics of the northern front and absolutely threw out the chance at all that they'd be able to do anything meaningful in that front anymore. So I think that's exactly what's going to happen in the East, and I think that this is all just kind of like Hail Mary option for them, where they're trying to save something out of this situation instead of just entirely lose it. So that's kind of my opinion on it. Once again, that's all based off of the public information we've gotten on this channel over 39 days at this point. So kind of do take it with a grain of salt. But with that, we're going to move on to the last question of this section, and then we're going to move to the Southern Front news.
And the last question of this segment goes to Rated PG, who says, Enforcer, about Russia's lack of a central theater commander. Is this Russian military doctrine, or is it Putin trying to avoid a single commander from becoming more prominent over him? What is your take?
I believe that it's really more of incompetence in the Russian military. There is a guy kind of in charge of it all. His name is Sergei Shoigu, and he is like the primary commander of the Russian armed forces in a way, right under Putin. And so there is someone who is filling that role, but it appears that beyond that, the decentralization of their command is huge and very vast. It looks like there's no coordination even amongst commanders in the same front, which is very interesting to me. And you can tell that by the actions that they take across most of the front line. So I hope that answers the question. Sorry if it's a little brief, but that's kind of like my overview of it. So I thank you very much once again for the question. And with that, we've reached the end of this question segment, and we're going to move on to the news from the Southern Front, starting with Izium. Here in Izium, we can actually see that there's a decent amount of damage there as well, which suggests that there has been heavy fighting inside the city. We don't know if the Ukrainians are still in control of it or the Russians. We're not entirely sure about that, but here's the video we've gotten from Izium.
Вот так вот. И вот мой подъезд. Школа. То, что осталось. Ну, а это, конечно, да.
As you can see, nothing but complete devastation and destruction, as usual in the Russian playbook. We're now going to move on a little bit more south, where we can see another TOS thermobaric system being used near Izium. These are pictures. We don't have a specific date, but we do know that this TOS was used in the Izium area. I'm not sure if this one was destroyed or not. We've actually seen a decent amount of TOSs get destroyed in the in Ukraine as a whole, and so hopefully this was one of those specific TOS systems that was destroyed. We're now going to move on to the area around Severodonetsk, where we've seen in the town of Rubizhny today that there are Russian forces fighting inside the city, as is backed up by this video. So I'm going to let y'all take a look at this. There we go, it finally loaded. So we can see that they're driving through the town. I'm not really sure if these are Russians or Ukrainians, but we can see a Russian tank moving past at speed. It appears to be a T-64BV. I'm going to let the video keep running. We can now see Russian forces, maybe some DPR, LPR troops, moving through the city. We can now see this guy with perfect aiming form, buttstock firmly placed on his shoulder. Well, really more like his collarbone, it should be. Firing at the Ukrainians. I know that his fire must be putting them down on the ground, because we know that firing like that, it must be incredibly accurate, suppressive fire. Russian tank is now barreling it back through the city again. We can hear more firefighting in the distance. Now this guy's got a generally better gist than his buddy here on how to actually fire a gun. Because unlike firing it like some kind of pistol, you know, they're called pistols here in the US. I know they're not pistols, but unlike firing it like that, where the stock isn't really placed on your shoulder and it's very poorly aimed, he's actually got it on his shoulder in a way. So I think if anyone's actually firing their gun right, it's probably this guy more so than the other, but it looks like both of them are lacking a pretty decent amount of training on how to actually use a gun. And so that's the end of that video. We're now going to move on from the Rubizhny area, where we can get the general idea now that most of the Luhansk region is under the control of the Russians, and we're now going to move on to the rest of the Donbass. This was somewhere in the Donbass, we're not entirely sure, but we can see more Russian tanks being wiped out in the Donbass area. So here's the video of that. If it loads, hopefully it does. There we go. So we can see here that these two Russian tanks are in the same part of the street. the footage kind of lags around a bit, but then it goes back and you can see the Russian tanks being hit by some kind of ATGM right there. We can then see what appears to be some kind of trench. I believe the trench is firing the ATGMs or it's receiving the fire. Not particularly sure. Yeah, it's receiving fire. This trench is taking fire. I'm not exactly sure whose side this trench is either. It may be Russian or Ukrainian. We don't really have a lot of information to tell. So that's really all we can get out of that video. But we can tell that the Russians appear to have a much better grasp on the Eastern Front and the Eastern Southern Front now than they ever had on the Northern Front. And I think they're going to pretty much withdraw entirely from the Northern Front, maybe even start pulling out of the Chernihiv and Sumy area as well as Kharkiv maybe, and just start focusing entirely on trying to control the ground down here in the Donbass. And then once they control the Donbass for a larger part, more or less, they're then going to pretty much do what they did with the DPR and LPR, which is create some kind of stalemate front line and maybe try and get some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire with the Ukrainians. So I guess you can say that their strategy switched from trying to besiege the two largest cities in Ukraine, Kyiv and Kharkiv, and now it's switched to their old tactics, which is kind of like claiming the land and then just trying to hold it through stalemate in a way. So we're now going to move on to the area around Mariupol, because we know that this happened in the Donetsk area of the Donbass, where we can see the DPR hitting Ukrainian positions. Here's the video of that. I'm not exactly sure where the Ukrainians are in this video. I'm assuming that it's close. They are close to the fire, but we can see DPR rounds coming in on them, and hopefully they've made it to cover, and most of them will be safe, and this attack wasn't all too effective. So we can see the next round come in. I don't think this is artillery, because we can actually see the angle that that round came in from, and it was a very shallow kind of path. So I'm assuming that it may actually be fire from some kind of tank or an artillery piece that is directly aiming forwards, because artillery pieces can't actually fire straight forward. It's just incredibly rare, and that's usually not the way you want to use an artillery piece. As we can see, they're continuing to take the fire. It appears to be coming in at a slow rate, actually. Looks like something you can kind of move around in between. It's almost like they're giving an intermission in between each shot. But I'm going to skip forward to the next round that hits, which is about 20 seconds later in the video. Let me find it. There we go. The next round hits here. I'm not really sure if that was close to the Ukrainian soldiers. We really can't see them too well in this video. I don't even know if they're actually firing at Ukrainians, because when you look in the tree line or near it, you can't see them anywhere. So I'm not really sure where they are, or even if they're firing at anything for that matter. So we're going to move on to the last round that hit, and actually hit off frame. It was that poorly aimed. Just hit somewhere over here in the top left of the screen. And now we can see the smoke coming from it. And hopefully the drone zooms out. I think it does. And you can see that that last impact hit somewhere right there. Pretty pathetic, really, that they're that poor at aiming the guns. And so we're now going to move on to the Mariupol area, where we've gotten a load of news today. Here we can see the Chechens fighting inside of a building. Of course, you know, we see a load of video evidence of Chechens fighting here, there, and everywhere inside of Mariupol. But once again, I think this is important to show, because it does show that there is ongoing fighting inside of Mariupol to this day, and we're trying to still collect the information as to how long the Azov battalion will hold, and we don't really have that information at the moment. So here's the video. This guy is wonderful. Look at him. I mean, look at the form. The buttstock clearly over his shoulder, clearly over his arm as a whole, and he's moving like some kind of spastic puppet. Like, look at him. Like, wait a minute, let me go back a little bit more. This guy, look at him. What is this stuff? I mean, this guy is so uncertain about what he's doing. Look. And he starts firing. Looks like he's really got a lot of control of that gun. I mean, like, he's firing in such small bursts, which of course usually jams a machine gun. You know, it's a machine gun. You use it like one. But the guy is just... Oh man, this guy's got no clue how to really use one, you can tell. I haven't had a lot of experience with machine guns, very little, but I do know that firing them in incredibly short bursts like this guy is kind of doing will lead them to jam much quicker than normal. Anyways, here's the rest of the video. And so that's the end of the video. As you can see, the Chechens are, of course, fighting the best they can, which is pretty poorly. And we're now going to move on to the next bit of video we've gotten inside of Mariupol, which is the DPR forces also fighting in Mariupol alongside the Chechens. So I'm going to show you this video. As you can see, they have a T-72B3 moving through the city, apparently firing into the buildings as normal. And we can see this guy, I think that's like some kind of carbine version of an SVD, because that's an incredibly short SVD if it is one. Now we can see the tank moving down the street, and that's the end of the video. Not much to show here, of course. They don't really like to show a lot, and once again, the only fire you hear in the video is theirs, which is always questionable. But we're now going to move on to the next bit of video we've gotten inside Mariupol, which is Russians hitting the buildings in the city once more. So I'm going to show you all this video. You can see it clearly. It's going to be right here in the middle of the screen. And of course, this was uploaded by Russia Today. But this does show them firing directly into residential buildings. Now, most of these buildings also look like they have suffered damage from extensive fires, which we did not see about a week ago, but now it seems like fires have been set in most of these buildings, and they've probably been entirely burned out. And so here's the video. You can see the fire coming in on these buildings. And now we can see footage from the tank that must be hitting these buildings, firing directly into them. Now you can see another round hitting that exact building again. Not exactly where the tank is in the aerial footage, but we do know that it must be the one actually hitting the targets in the aerial footage, because it's kind of correlating in a way. So that's the end of that video, and we're now going to move on to the last bit of video, where we can see the DPR once again inside of Mariupol. This is another bit of footage of them, but here's the video nonetheless. As we see, once again, incredible aim on the part of the DPR troops. Look at this guy. He is definitely looking down the sights. You know, see, there's the sight picture. You know, he's got a whole load of room above the sight, so I know that he's definitely looking down them for sure. It's just that he might not be looking at them. He's just looking around them. It also looks like... it just looks like he knows exactly what he's doing. I have a full confidence that he is an incredibly good fighter, and that the Ukrainians will have a really tough time dealing with this guy and how he's shooting. Now we can see a BMP, I believe, moving forward. I'm not sure if that's BMP 1 or 2. That's BMP 1. Ancient. We now see them loading a magazine. Because, you know, the Russians probably think that's cool. I mean, you know, everyone has to load a magazine, but why show it? We now see them doing a little bit of renovation work. Now, BTR-82 is outside of their building firing. And also, let's see, we have another Russian. This one actually looks like he kind of got the lesson on how to shoot down, shoot with a gun, because he's actually kind of looking down the sights in a way, which is good. And it looks like he's kind of got the stock on his shoulder, so it looks like this guy has learned a little bit of something. I also will say he's been shooting near this wall for a bit, because it's got a decent amount of burn on it from the heat of the you know, projectile being fired out of it, and the powder that comes with it. It's of course pretty hot. So anyways, the video. So now you see them moving a wounded man through. And so that's the end of the video. Once again, I have to say about the city of Mariupol, we're not really sure how long the city will hold or how long it'll really last in the long run, but we do know that they are holding and they have served their purpose, which is buying time for the rest of Ukraine by eating up Russian resources and manpower in trying to take this city. The Azov has been fighting incredibly strongly against the Russians, and so I have to give them a full credit for what they've done. It's very impressive, and I have to say kudos to them for holding the city for that long. We're now going to move on to the last bits of news we've gotten, which we've actually gotten some news from the Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa areas of the coastline, where we can see in Kherson, although the protesters were broken up violently about a week ago, we can see them here still protesting, and you've got to give them credit. They're very resilient people here in Kherson. We don't know where the Ukrainian forces are exactly around the city. We know that they're getting close, but right there we couldn't hear any fire in the distance, so I don't really know if they are a couple of miles away from the city or if they're right up on it. Not entirely sure. But we're now going to move on to Mykolaiv, which showed us an interesting sight again today, where we can see that artillery shells were once again raining on the city of Mykolaiv again. I don't know exactly why, because we know that Russian forces are no longer anywhere near the city of Mykolaiv, but it appears that they are shelling the city once more, which is interesting to me, and we'll try and get more information about what's going on there as the days go by. So we're now going to move on to the news inside of Odessa, where there has been large news today and yesterday as missile strikes appear to rock the city overnight. Here's a bit of that footage from the missile strikes. And let me go to the YouTube short showing it. As you can see, the missile exploded in the distance. As far as we know, it was actually on an oil silo. As we can see, another missile struck the oil silo. So that's the end of the video. The video once again goes into a loop. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the video from the morning where we saw the damage that had been caused to the oil silo. Once again, the Russians are probably trying to just imitate what the Ukrainians did with the raid on the Belgorod silo. But here we can see that they did it with cruise missiles instead, which is the much easier way to do it. And so here's the after effects of the damage next morning. As you can see, the fire is raging in the silos. Once again, oil fires are very hard to contain once they start. Usually you just have to let them burn out, and the best you can do is try and contain the damage, as far as I know. But then again, that's all based off of my knowledge. That may be wrong. Let me know in the chat if you do know a little bit more about how oil fires operate. But as far as we could lay out in the Belgorod attack, oil fires are pretty hard to put out, if not impossible, especially when they're at this scale. So with that, that's the end of the video. And we're now going to move on from Ukraine to the international news, because we've had a little bit of it, one in Germany and one in Moscow. We'll start off in Moscow, though, because I want y'all to see the interviews that were conducted with some average Russian citizens and what they think about the war. It's a speech-to-text video, so there is no like vocal translation, but there is subtitles at the bottom translating what they're saying. So check out this video and see what you think about it. 1 second, it's loading. There we go.
Думаете, чем все закончится?
Надо ее снести со земли и все.
Украину?
Да.
Зачем?
А зачем она нужна?
А потом кого сносить еще?
Польшу. Просто до кучи.
Всех снести. А зачем? А что мы будем делать с этой территорией?
А это что вообще за страны такие? Украина. Это не страна. Это кусок Ленин тогда отдал в свое время. Вот. А это Прибалты, это вообще всю жизнь они были против России. Надо думать, прежде чем ты начал воевать, да, воевать надо. с хохлами. Это однозначно. Тут никаких даже вопросов не может быть. Нацисты. С ними надо воевать.
А чем может закончиться? Вольнем хохлов. Больше никак нельзя. Вариантов больше нет.
I love how these people here, you know, it's something, you know, not every Russian supports the war. We know that. But I'm starting to get the picture that the large majority of Russians actually do support the war, or they're indifferent to it, which may as well be support. Because this guy pretty much said, yeah, wipe them all out, including the civilians, because they're all Nazis in a way, which that's just sickening. But anyways, we're now going to move on to the next guy here who says there's no other option than to just wipe them out. So here's the interview with him.
Что будем делать с вот этой территорией разбомбленной?
Почему разбомблены? Операция идет нормально, вроде как, без всяких там этих. Начнут ковровые бомбардировки, так это их уже дело. И вот эта падаль нацистская, вы теперь спрашиваете, что мы с ним будем делать? Вольнем.
Украина станет вторичным государством, которое не будет принимать ни в чем участие. А мы будем забирать эту землю себе.
Правильно считаете?
Это так и было раньше. Все возвращается к своим истокам.
Вы знаете, очень трудно сказать, потому что если... Все зависит, что Америка будет делать. Она пока боится выступить, очень боится. Потому что у нас есть очень сильные несколько ракет, которые снесут вообще Америку, если их запустят. Они их не запускают. Они вокруг, один раз провели вокруг Америки, и после этого те заглохли. Думаю, что все закончится.
You know, I don't even think these people really understand what's going on outside of their country, because she said we have a few missiles that are strong enough to absolutely wipe out America. Like, she's just saying, like, it sounded like she thought, oh, we only have 3 of these big missiles, and if we launch them, one missile will just wipe out the entirety of the United States. It'll be like the movie 2012 or something. And, you know, I mean, these are, you know, of course, run-of-the-mill people, and usually, you know, not saying that I'm just on a pedestal here of military intelligence. I don't know everything, but these people know nothing. But anyways, we're going to let the interview continue.
Нормально, но дело в том, что мы же ее потом поднимать будем. Вот весь ужас в чем. Нам же эту Украину потом опять отстраивать, от промышленность им создавать и прочее, прочее, прочее.
Мне кажется, что, наверное, мы все-таки возьмем под крылышко всех этих бедных граждан. И все будет хорошо. Я думаю, что Путин создаст для них лучшие условия для жизни и там, и здесь, и даст там достойное образование людям, и хорошую жизнь спокойную, все-таки стабильную. Я думаю, что все наладится, и все будет хорошо. Мы все-таки дружные народы.
And I think she doesn't even know what's going on in Ukraine right now, which of course is evident of the Russian media lying so much in the reporting of the news. So we're now going to move on to Germany. You know, that speaks for itself. I'm not going to give a lot of commentary on it because it's really a self-explanatory kind of thing. So we're now going to move on to Germany, which has a very interesting situation develop in it today. There is a large amount of Russians who actually moved to Germany in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they have kind of made a Russian community inside of Germany. Today we saw a large group of them come out in support of the Russians and what they're doing, and so here's the footage of that protest. Very interesting to see, and I wonder how what the German reaction is to that protest inside of Berlin today. Anyways, we've actually covered all of the news for the day. Sorry if my commentary wasn't too well today. I was actually still pretty caught up in the thought and idea of all the war crimes that we saw at the beginning of the video, and so my mind was a little bit distracted, but I hope everyone bared with it a little bit. And so with that, we're now going to move on to some more questions from the chat, and we're also going to recognize some of our big donors. And before we get to that, Matthew, how close are we to the goal?
So we're currently sitting somewhere above 11,000. We are extremely close, from what I understand, to reaching our goal. I think we're just a couple $100 off, if I'm correct. So very, very, very close. And real quickly, I just want to recognize a couple of top donors we have tonight. We have a $100 donation from Patro and Joro, and a $50 donation from Being Altaffer. And as always, as mentioned before, Thank you to everyone else who has donated. If I were to sit here and list off everyone, we'd be here all night, and I'm sure everybody would get bored of that. So thank you. We have noticed your donations, and we appreciate it very, very much. And with that being said, I am ready to give you some questions when you're ready, Enforcer.
All right, so we're going to answer about 10 questions from the chat. Hopefully we'll reach the goal by the time we get around to the end of the questions. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
So we have a question from Duncan VR who says, question, after World War II, there were Nazi hunters. Now the news said mass graves in Ukraine. Do you think there will be individuals hunting Russians who committed these horrible crimes?
I think there will be. These kind of war crimes will mobilize people from all around the world to get behind Ukraine, even when the war may be over, to try and hunt down these Russian war criminals that will be clearly known for who they are and what they did in the war. I hope that everyone can agree with me that the actions that we saw and the results of them that we saw on film today are completely unspeakable and horrid, and that the people who did commit these crimes should be brought to justice. So I hope that answers the question in a way, and I do believe that that will be a thing, because history does repeat itself in many ways, much like this is almost a complete repetition of the Winter War, and so I do believe that there will be hunters of people who are looking for Russians who committed war crimes afterwards. And so I thank you very much for the question, and with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And with that being said, we have reached our goal. We just hit $12,000, so everybody just smashed the goal, and it's absolutely amazing. We raised $12,000 since the stream started about an hour and 45 minutes ago, roughly. That is absolutely incredible.
I thank y'all so much, everyone. This is wonderful. I'm glad that we've reached the goal again, and we're able to support Ukraine, a huge deal, and help out Doctors Without Borders. This means a lot to me, and although the news at the beginning of the stream was very sad and it kind of let me in a down mood, I'm glad to know that we all can still rally around and support them as much as possible. And so thank you all so much for all the support you've given. It means a lot to me, and I know it's going to mean a lot to the Ukrainians who, in the end, will receive the support that we have helped fund and support in a way. And so I thank you all so much. It means a lot to me, and I'm glad that we can continue to do the great things and all the help that we've possibly been doing during this entire war. And so thank you all once again, and with that, we're going to get back to the questions.
And the next question up is from JustABill02, who says, last we saw, there were a substantial number of Russians in the pockets west of the capital cut off from retreat. Were those soldiers captured, killed, or managed to get out?
I'm not really sure what happened to him, because we didn't really get a story as to if they broke out or if they were destroyed or not. We know that the Ukrainian police were actually going through, and it looked like they were taking out stragglers. So maybe they had destroyed the pocket almost entirely, and then they went through and cleaned it up, and then afterwards it was done with. I'm not entirely sure. The information about the Northern Front as a whole and how it collapsed and how the Russians retreated and such is kind of a little foggy, and so we're still waiting for some clarification on the actual sequence of events. And unfortunately, I think that news will only come out after the war is over, and while everyone's still trying to collect the pieces and gather up the information. So I hope that answers the question in a way. Unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of info on how exactly it happened, but I do thank you for the question, and with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And I want to recognize James Menard for putting in a $200 Canadian donation. Thank you. Very, very generous, and we appreciate it. Next question up we have from Horrible Beast, who says, Enforcer, what would be the reason for the civilians wearing the white armbands? I love your streams.
The civilians, I think you may be saying the civilians are wearing white armbands, but if you look at the video a little bit more, which the link in the link to this map is in the description, so you can go and check it out for yourself. They aren't actually wearing white armbands, I don't believe. They actually had their hands tied with white cloth, which maybe, well, you know, we see examples of this whenever the Ukrainians capture Russian prisoners. They used a blue duct tape that they used to identify themselves to tie up Russian prisoners, like, you know, put their hands behind their back and cover their eyes and such things. And so I think that's what the Russians did, is that they had a whole bunch of white cloth around to mark themselves and identify them as Russian and such. And so when they gathered up these civilians, they would just use the white cloth they had lying around to tie up their hands and then execute them. I didn't see any armbands. I only saw ties around their arms and legs. So I hope that answers the question in a way. And with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And the next one is from Gabby B, who says, when this war is over, do you think the people of Russia will find out the real truth of Putin and his soldiers' atrocities?
I don't think they will. Putin, if he's still in charge of the country after this war, they will never find out. That will be hidden from them, and they'll be told, if they ever hear of it, that it's nothing more than lies being propagated by the West, because the Russians couldn't possibly do that kind of thing to anyone in the world, because they are the shining light of hope and they're the saviors of the world, is probably what they'll be told. So I don't think the Russians will ever actually know truly the extent of the crimes and horrors that they perpetrated inside of Ukraine during this war. And so that's kind of my answer to the question. Then again, that's kind of still my opinion based off of what we know. So take it with a grain of salt. That's really just my take on it. But with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And the next question of the night goes to Carlos Brasino, who says, Enforcer, this will just escalate the war and make it even more vicious. These killed civilians, of course, were relatives and friends of Ukrainian soldiers. How will they behave from now on?
I think the Ukrainians have been behaving because they've already been knowing that the Russians attack civilians without any kind of constraint whatsoever. Not behind the lines, but on the lines. Like, for example, in Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kyiv, we've seen civilians get killed without any regard. And so the Ukrainians, I believe, are still going to act with the great restraint that we've seen so far, although there may be the isolated outlash from the Ukrainian soldiers where they do gun down some Russian prisoners or something like that. But I don't think it'll be widespread. But we will, of course, have to wait and see if we get any evidence or information coming out about that. And all I have to say is, if that kind of stuff happens, I can kind of understand where they're coming from now, knowing that they are fighting pretty much a band of war criminals. And so with that, that's kind of my take on it. And with that, we're going to move on to about 5 more questions, and then we're going to end the stream. So with that, on to the next question.
And the next question of the night is from Vatazur333, who says, do you think Anonymous will hack Russian TV and spam the war crime videos to get the truth out to the people? Any news of Anonymous doing this as of yet?
We know that Anonymous has been operating a decent deal and attacking the Russian infrastructure on the internet. I don't really know if that will include trying to get this information to the public in Russia. We know that they've been doing that to a small degree, but I don't know if that's something that they're eyeballing to do on a larger scale. So we'll, of course, have to wait and see if that is something that they do. I think it might be in their itinerary as kind of like a goal they want to achieve. But then again, I'm not entirely sure if that will be the case or not. But I do feel like it will be something that they're eyeballing and trying to do at the moment. But then again, that's kind of my take on it. I don't really keep up with the cyber warfare side of things all too much. I generally focus on the ground war on this channel. So if that statement does seem off compared to their actions, I am a little ignorant on what exactly they are doing, because it's kind of something that isn't really reported on or talked about much, and it isn't something that you see happening on the front lines. Like, you don't see a guy with an anonymous Guy Fawkes mask or something on the front lines, like attacking someone's laptop with a sledgehammer or anything. So I don't really report it here on this channel. But I hope that answers the question in a way. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And the next question of the night goes to Jason Baker, who says, Enforcer, do you believe there's any Western leader with the resolve and character to order the assassination of Putin and take full responsibility in the International Criminal Court?
I don't think there is anyone who would do that in the West. Putin seems to have something of a rival for a short time in Biden, because Biden started talking about the guy, Putin was a war criminal and a terrible person and such. But it appears that kind of language has been toned down, I guess, after consulting some of the advisors in the cabinet, and it seems like that's been toned down a large deal. So I think that was the only person who was really stepping up and trying to do anything against the Russians directly, specifically against Putin, and it looks like that's kind of been toned down a bit. So that's really all I got to say on that. I don't really think anyone will do that, unfortunately, but then again, that's kind of my opinion based off of the public information I've been able to gather and what we've kind of been seeing unfold over the past month and a week at this point. And so I thank you very much for the support. I hope that answers your question in a way. And so with that, we're going to move on to 3 more questions from the chat.
And next up, we have a question from Bradley Carriger, who says, raising the nose of the helicopter to shoot unguided rockets is typical in many militaries, including the U.S. at times. Not so much to avoid AA, but to improve the arc, just for your information.
Yes, while it may improve the arc, though, it's a common known fact that the farther range you fire anything from, the less accurate it is. And so while it is improving the arc, that's of course that's obvious. I mean, like I've stated that before in multiple videos, is that they're doing that to improve the range of the rockets. It does lead to them being landing in a much wider area than, say, at a closer distance where the helicopter is pointing downwards, looking directly at the target. So I thank you very much for the info. But I did know that already because I've actually said that a lot on stream. That I note that every single time, and that's usually to avoid ground fire, because if you weren't scared of ground fire, why not just fly directly onto the target and hit it accurately instead of trying to hit it at a distance? I'm no expert in military tactics, but that seems to be devoid of common sense to get farther range, but also be less accurate if there's a lack of any kind of threat that could damage or shoot down the helicopter. So I thank you very much for the input, but with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And next up, we have a question from Speak.Truth, who says, Enforcer, I hate to say it, but Mariupol will fall. Do you know anything about the 2 helicopters shot down by the Russians? Supposedly, it was the Azov battalion attempting to escape.
No, and I don't think 2 helicopters would make the entire Azov battalion escape. I believe that the Azov battalion is around 800 to 1,000 men, and a single Hind can only carry around 8 to 12 people. So I don't think that that's the Azov trying to escape, and I haven't heard anything about that, unfortunately. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I do thank you for the input. And so with that, we're going to move on to 2 more questions from the chat, and then we're going to end the stream. And so what do we got next, Matthew?
And now we have a question from 66 Ross, who says, Enforcer, a couple of weeks ago, some general said that the Russians were going to run out of ammo in 10 days. Was he just wrong, or are they actually running out?
I don't think they're running out of ammo. I think that was kind of a bit of a exaggeration. Their logistical situation is falling apart, so some Russian units we do know are most likely low on ammo, but the Russians have a stockpile of old Soviet gear. That's why they have like 12,000 tanks, or 14. It's a huge number. It's over 10,000 tanks, but most of them aren't usable. And it's kind of the same thing with their with the armories in Russia, is that they have loads of equipment that is left over from Soviet times. And so I don't think they're running out of ammo, but I think they're running out of the ability to actually deliver that to the front lines and make sure it's used by the troops fighting in Ukraine. So I think that would be more so an accurate description of the situation. But it appears that they're managing to get by somehow, but it looks like really poorly, because the northern front may have collapsed because the situation there got so bad after they introduced the 40-mile-long convoy, which started to eat up a whole load of supplies. And so then the situation up there was never going to reverse itself, and they decided to just withdraw, or the front collapsed. It was one or the other. We're still trying to get information on that, but that's kind of my take on it right now. Thank you very much for the question. That was a pretty good one. And so we're going to move on to the last question of the night. And so what do we got, Matthew?
And the final question of the night, our lucky viewer is M. Adams. He asks, Enforcer, how much of a role does Russian Orthodoxy play in Putin's war?
The Russian Orthodoxy doesn't really play a huge role. As far as I know, I'm kind of ignorant on the religious structure in Russia, but I think the Russian Orthodoxy is kind of like the Baptist Church here in the United States. While it has a huge following, and a lot of people follow that specific kind of faith, the thing is that it doesn't really have much to do in terms of government. It's not like the Russian Tsardom, where the Eastern Orthodoxy was kind of tied into the government. It's kind of detached now, as far as I know, although they do hold a high regard in the Russian government. So that's kind of my opinion on it. I don't really know much. I really like to claim ignorance on that, but that's kind of the information I can give right now as to how important they are in terms of the Russian government and how much of a role they play. And so I hope that answers the question a pretty good bit. But with that, it is now time to end the stream. And so I hope I've answered everyone's questions pretty well. I hope you all got something good out of the news. I'm sorry, honestly, tonight I don't really feel like the news was that great, because the beginning infuriated me so much just looking at it again. It was really hard for me to focus and try and deliver the rest of the news tonight. So I apologize for that to everyone who may have noticed that. But I thank you all so much for getting $12,000 raised for Doctors Without Borders. That is a huge deal, and I'm incredibly happy that we were all able to come together and do that as a community again. And so I can't say thank you enough. That's a huge deal to me, and I hope it's a huge deal to y'all, because once again, we've all come together and done a great deal of good. And so I thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great night. Once again, I'll be taking Monday off. Monday will be an off day from now on the channel, so that way I can make sure to stay well rested and make sure that these streams keep on going on well and I don't get worn out. And so I thank you all once again, and I hope you all have a great night, and I'll see y'all all on Tuesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time as usual. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great night and a great Monday. See y'all around.